starting now. This is what we wanted to do in the workshop was to drill down into innovative practices relating to juvenile justice. So that's what we wanted to do. And I thought there's 4 areas that we could touch on at least. I don't want to sit there and talk back to you guys. So what I thought we might do, can you hear me? Can you hear me? I'll introduce 4 topics. Actually, I'll introduce these. Then if you've got things that you want to talk about, then we'll put them up as well. Just little place over here. And then we can discuss, okay? Because I don't really want to do this, okay? So, very quickly, we all may or may not have heard of restorative justice, the idea that you've got communities and offenders and victims coming together, premised on the idea of participation and repairing of harm. And that's been legislatively institutionalized in Tasmania in the Juvenile Justice Act in the form of juvenile conferencing, which we're the only place in the world that has 2 types of conferencing in the same jurisdiction. We have police conferencing, and we also have Health and Human Services does conferencing usually after court, and police do theirs usually before court. But the conference means getting together young people and and it's usually got a youth justice coordinator of some kind who facilitates the conference and so on. But what I think is really innovative is this project that I'll describe here. And it's a Canadian project from Edmonton in Canada. And these young people have been lobbying the court, the children's court or the juvenile court for a long time. And they said, well, let us run the conference. And a judge finally, or magistrate finally one day said, you do it. And fascinating because it's young people running the conference. It's not old people. The young people running the conference, they took a broad cross-selection of the young people. So they come from a diverse range of class and ethnic and gender backgrounds, but especially disadvantaged backgrounds. So the majority of the young people who were doing the conference were in fact from disadvantaged backgrounds. So it's really participatory, and this is what's really interesting about this. And then their first case, and listen carefully, Chinese-Canadian bloke gets vilified by a young neo-Nazi type bloke. And so the Asian guy stabs the fascist. So I'm using that extreme language to give you a sense that here's this Asian guy walking down the street and this neo-Nazi starts calling him names and all that stuff, and the Asian kid pulls out a knife and goes, bang, stuff you. So it goes to court because, of course, it's criminal assault with literally a deadly weapon, the knife. And so the first case that these guys had to deal with was that case. But bear in mind that it's an ethnically mixed background group. And they're thinking, well, hang on, this Asian guy was being racially vilified, but at the same time, we can't really allow, as the law says, people going around with a knife killing people. So they worked it through, and they thought, well, what can we do, and what's the best way to respond in this case? And so they had a social space where they had multimedia and music and all that kind of stuff. So in the end, after working through the issues with the offender, they got the offender to then produce a rap song about racism. But basically, the intent behind the whole process was to socialize the offender so that they wouldn't knife somebody if somebody called them a name again, right? So that the message is being conveyed, but at the same time, the offender doesn't get further disadvantaged from basically what was an injustice to start with. But the point of this story is, and I've never heard of this anywhere else, but I think it's really cool to have young people actually doing the conferencing, not a youth justice facilitator. It's all professionalized now. Sorry, I could go into a long, long history of juvenile conferencing and restorative justice, but part of the intent at the beginning was to not have professionals run the thing and not to make it into a set script.
Were you talking about young people doing it in Tasmania?
In Tassie, yeah. No, this is a Canadian example from Edmonton. But I thought, I'm just tossing it out there. I just thought it was an interesting idea. The second thing is a school community hub. idea, and we're doing some work with the Smith family here in Lonnie. They're setting up a hub, and the idea is to get primary then high school kids to increase their rate of participation and scores and so on. But I thought the connection back to juvenile justice for us is also raises interesting issues of school community and justice in terms of why not more restorative justice in schools. Where it's been trialled in various places, say in Queensland, some principals hate it because they think, well, they just want to discipline the kids. So there's some really interesting stuff around whether and how we use restorative justice methods, bringing people together to discuss issues of conflict within a school setting. The other issue from work that we've done over time is that if you can have collaborative practice, school, community, collaborations and so on, often there's quite different roles and missions on the part of teachers, social workers, youth workers and so on. They all want to do the best thing for children. So at one level, they're all on the same page, but their mandate, in fact, is really different. So they want to talk about education and schooling. They want to talk about the unique individual community needs of young people, and they want to talk about, that is, the social workers want to talk about perhaps case management, casework on an individual one-to-one basis. So they have quite different specific tasks. They're also guided by different workplace-related ideologies. So, for example, if I'm a teacher, I have to be at school. It's my job, sorry, and I have to report to the principal. If I'm a youth worker, I can come and go as I please, and I'm not accountable, basically, because that's the nature of youth work, is that you work in the community, you go where the kids are at, not necessarily where the institution's at. And then social workers have a professional ethics mandate and a therapeutic mandate, but they're different from youth workers because social workers, by law, have certain confidentiality. So you can tell the social worker something, and they're protected under professional ethics and by law from disclosing what you've said to that social worker. Youth workers don't have that. So there's interesting occupational differences that will influence how people relate and how they relate to each other. So some work that we've done, 10 years ago, we had a project in Tassie where we were called in by the education department because there's big blues between social workers and teachers in some of the Tassie high schools. And when we pulled it apart, it was occupational missions. And they were using same language, but different purposes. But when we pulled that apart, then my social work colleagues at UTAS social worked the social workers. Anyway, third example, justice reinvestment. Justice reinvestment arose out of the United States. It's now growing in the UK, and there's bits and pieces of it developing in Australia. The idea behind justice reinvestment is you take money out of the prisons and you put it into the communities from where the prisoners come from. So basically, you reinvest the money out of the coercive system and you put it into a developmental side of stuff. That's at the community level. Another form of justice reinvestment is to take money out of the prisons and corrective services system and invest it in individuals. I have real problems with both, actually. Very quickly, I think it's very stigmatizing of communities. They do data collection. We've heard that a few times here. And it's like reinforcing, like one of our schools this morning from a certain area, reinforcing the negative image of that place and stigmatization, and then the money is being pulled out of the prison to be put into Ravenswood, or, let's name the name. And what it does is it's counterproductive, and it's stigmatizing and so on. There's an exception, which I'll describe in 2 seconds. And individuals, to pull your money out of corrective services in the prison to individuals, it sounds good on the surface, but basically you're changing the individual, not changing conditions within which that individual's coming through. So it has positive impact, but only for that individual. The exception, possibly, to what I'm saying is Indigenous people. Because we have unbelievably high rates of overrepresentation of Indigenous people across the country. And there may be some circumstances where we should literally take the money out of corrections, especially Northern Territory and Western Australia, put it into the Indigenous communities. The problem, of course, is that we don't want another intervention. because that's about disempowering and taking control and power out of Indigenous hands, and it's government by fiat from above. All right, the fourth thing that I want to mention briefly is some of you even might be part of an interagency team. We have them in the Northwest, we've got them in the North, we've got them in the South. And it's interdepartmental teams. No? Nobody? Yes? And they've been going for a couple of years, and I think was first trialed, at least in my experience, in Glenorchy. I remember being in Glenorchy when they tried to get this interagency team going, because the same kids were coming up on all, through the schools, through welfare, through housing, through crisis intervention, and through the police. It was the same kids. By the way, it was precisely out of that kind of meeting that a research project was born that, in fact, our current Attorney General, Vanessa Goodwin, undertook, and it was on families that had intergenerational offending. And so she did a study and discovered that about 5 families were doing all this crime. The youth crime was in the hands of about five families. But it raises questions. The interdepartmental and interagency teams raise questions about knowledge transfer, what kind of knowledge, privacy. There's ways to do it. If you talk to Robert Williams, our Deputy Secretary of Justice, he says, from his previous work for the Commonwealth, he says there's ways of knowledge transfer that aren't necessarily intrusive in terms of privacy, etc., but we need to share that knowledge. But how do you do it in a fair, just way? And the other question I have is that we don't want to slip into deficit talk. So that kid's before me because I'm from justice and he's got a problem. Or that kid's before me because I'm from housing and that kid's got a problem. And it becomes problem-centered and deficit language rather than strengths-based and all that kind of stuff. So those are 4 areas which I'm just going to toss it out for any considerations. And if you've got other things that you'd like to discuss, this is the time to do it. So. So hang on. We're always looking for feedback. Whoops.
I was just talking about justice reinvention and saying that, or investment, that it can be adapted to suit the conditions. And when you were saying taking the money into jails, I'm talking about, say, taking the money out of Ashley Detention Centre, where there are 10 kids with $40 million, and perhaps looking at therapeutic models in the different regions of the state. And I think there's people like you to help design something like that is appropriate as a justice reinvestment model.
That's a really good example. Ashley should be closed, and it should be closed today. But there needs to be a transition program for the staff, as well as for the 10 kids who are still out there. But basically, it's a horrible infrastructure. And there's some really dedicated staff who work with those kids. But a lot of those staff could still work with those kids, but in a different kind of setting. And way better use of money. So.
Well, I'm just wondering what your take is. Like, school community is a great way to reintegrate young people back into communities. It's getting through the attitude of what are sort of some of the principles. How do you go about doing that? Like from my own past experience and other colleagues of mine, it is one of the big stumbling blocks, is when they have to go to schools and try and help these students fit back into a school community that's only structured for sort of mainstream. Do you have any suggestions about how you approach senior staff at schools to even get these conversations happening?
Approach senior staff at schools and get outside people in to have a chat. That's one. Whoa. Okay. Oh, it's him, not me. The other thing is, somebody else said this before, you can't sort of just plunk in. Go and have chats without an agenda. I think that would be one way, and just talk to the school people and some of the community people, but without necessarily having an agenda, and suss out that. The other thing, in the end, depending on, is that working? Yeah. Oh, it is. Okay. I've also seen some alternative schools that have worked really, really well, and it's a way to keep particularly disempowered young people in the system. The worst thing you can do to young people is suspend and expel them. Absolutely the worst thing. If you need to take them out of the circulation, take them out of circulation but not out of the school. But a lot of this is just conversation stuff, and and case studies and ideas. And we've got people in Tassie who've started up and worked in alternative schools. I'm thinking of a friend, Peter Flint, in Hobart, who used to have a school in Geelong, and it worked tremendously well. They had 4 guideline rules that everybody was bound by, and that's it. Respect was one, but respect meant the teachers were bound by the same guidelines. So it was safety, honesty, respect, and something else. So there's ways and ways, but that's not really answering your question. But I think the key thing is just have the discussions and listen carefully to the responses. I can't say, see, because unless you're on the spot, one size doesn't fit all. Also, people have different visions of what it is that they want school to do. I remember arguing 20 years ago about using schools as closer to 24/7 institutions, because it can bring communities into schools, and that works really well. I've seen some fantastic projects where both communities and teachers and students have come in. An art project in Whyalla in South Australia, an art class, and you had these thuggish-looking, tattooed, earringed, I'm stereotyping, sorry, but 17-year-old males making pieces of jewelry and making rock music posters, and they were so wrapped in it, and they were learning and they were cooperating without realizing it. So there's really creative stuff, but they did it all outside of hours, and they did it on the weekends. And when some of these kids, when they graduated from high school, they came back and said, "Hey, listen, teacher, can I keep coming to the classes and keep coming?" So I think there's creative things that we can do, not from a program perspective, but also from a facility perspective. Sorry, I'm rabbiting on.
I think it's interesting that you named up that one of the worst things that we can do is actually exclude children from school. And yet it would be one of the biggest single factors that is impacting on our work, working with families and young people. And I was just wondering how you actually break that, because when we're trying to support kids into the school environment, we may succeed in getting them back. They're back for a day, they do one thing, and then they're rejoicing because they've been kicked out yet again. So how do you put the supports around the schools so that they actually have the resources to actually deal with these children in a way that helps them?
Oh, look, you're asking really simple questions. Not. There's so many layers of complexity in what you've just said, it's not funny. Complexities of, for a start, seeing the kid having a problem with the school rather than often it's the kids who have the problem with the school that's got the problem with the kids. And that sometimes the schools themselves are structured in a way that's very exclusive. Or you can bend over backwards, and sometimes we just have to bite the bullet and tell the kids what to do. And there is an element of compulsion that it's not necessarily a bad thing. We do up our seatbelts, and over time we develop the attitude that we want to do our seatbelts up. Sometimes we do need to compel people. It's in the juvenile justice framework, it's called strategic forgiveness. So if you think of restorative justice, we'll say, if you can paint that fence that you just smashed in or graffitied, then we'll think about not putting you inside Ashley. But it's strategic forgiveness, so they'll be forgiven if they do something in return. So I think there's ways, but it's a multi-pronged issue, and it's really tough. And depending on the constituency as well, you may find that sometimes we do need to think of alternatives for some young people. But you have to look really carefully at alternative schools, because the ones that work are the ones that evolve quickly into the sense of responsibility by the young people themselves. And there is examples of good practice in that. But the other thing is, you want to protect the bulk of your students from disruptive students as well. And so that we can't shy away from the fact that there's a reason why we take that kid out of the classroom.
Hi, I'm doing the consultation for the Northern Suburbs School Community Partnership, and I was talking to a mum who was complaining about the lack of consistency in the policy around exclusion and other children, how other children are treated depending on whether they've been before, how well the teacher's coping in the classroom, those sort of things. One of the funniest things she said, it's super funny, please don't judge me, was, I'm a single mum of 5 children, and do I look like the type of person that's going to exclude one of the kids because they step out of line? They can't do it, it doesn't happen. And she said, maybe I should try that on the teacher. No, sorry, you said something that's offended me, I'm excluding you now.
Actually, there was a project, Mark Stranger did a youth crime prevention project approximately 13 years ago. That's available on the crime prevention site. If you go into Crime Prevention Australia or whatever, the report's available on that site. But the topic was absenteeism. And I think that if you can address issues of absenteeism, you're getting closer to addressing issues of exclusion. Because the response that they trialled in some schools in Hobart was that they phoned up and they followed up. Every child who didn't come to school was followed up, and with the parents and all that, and it was a regular system of monitoring, and so that the kid wouldn't just get signed off in the morning and then disappear for the day. There's a system of monitoring, but the idea was not to penalize the children for absenteeism, it was to understand why they're absent. And what they discovered in some cases, it was the parents were having problems coping. And so they'd get the kid to come home to help them. Or, in other words, there's a multitude of different reasons why the kids would absent themselves. But I think that if you can, rather than focus on expelling and excluding children, if we recast it and say, why do we have a problem with absenteeism? In this report, I commend the report. It's quite a useful report, and it's Tasmanian. So.
Hi, I'm Wendy Newton. I work at Launceston City Council, so this is a very loaded question about where local government sits within any of these kinds of models, and even more generally speaking around, I guess, enabling young people around that participatory democracy, because I think that we talk a lot about enabling and empowering capacity building, and I'm not sure after 6 years of working in the sector whether I actually know what that means anymore, because I tend to think that councils are more focused on getting young people engaging with council instead of engaging in their own community. So I guess it's a fairly broad question, but I'm interested in your response.
Anybody else want to have a go at that?
This is the problem that councils have, I think, in terms of how you make that meaningful. And, when you're talking about the Edmonton example around that, how were how did those kids get the skills, for example, to actually run that type of...
They were trained up. They were trained up. So this is the fear fee as well. We shouldn't go, to young people and children and say, what would you do? What policy would you have? You got to train people up, and it's a dialectical process. Oh, I love that word. But it's a process of to and froing with older, more experienced. It's mentoring, but it's more than just mentoring, because also you want to make sure that you're making sure that the real decisions are being made by the young people. But there are examples of what councils can do. One is have an explicit youth policy, children and youth policy. Another is put money behind it, right?
I'll write that one down.
Yeah, because most of the time it's tokenistic unless there's some money behind it. And a third one behind, in addition to that, is that if the young people who end up being your representative group or whatever make a decision, you, the council, should be bound by that decision. So there's some threats and opportunities if it's to be done and taken seriously. But there's also, in addition to that, as a democratic, participatory type of umbrella, you can also have specific projects where you're working with local young people. We saw examples actually at this conference where the young people, the children themselves, were describing what they would like to see in their community. But there's the stuff that Karen Maloney's done, especially in the past, fantastic stuff. They would take the young people on walking trips and or on bicycles, and they get the young people to describe in their own terms what this area is like. Or they get young people to use the 4 senses and rename all your streets. And so they had an Italian project where they renamed the streets, Trash Avenue or Sad Alley. And so they're using certain emotions as a way to convey what the streets meant and so on. The other work that over time we've done with young people in public space has been, we say, where do you feel safe? And they said, down by the river, underneath the bridge. And then other kids say, you say, well, where do you feel unsafe? And the other kids will say, well, down by the river, underneath the bridge. In other words, there's multiple conceptions and perceptions. And just on that point, a final one is that in Bankstown in Sydney, they did a survey and they discovered that all the young people wanted to hang around the train station, and it was a bus station, train station, multiple transit point, because they felt unsafe. And they surveyed the older people in the community, and they all felt unsafe because of all these groups of young people hanging out at the train. So, but a lot of that, you can get through that through consultation and so on. I'm sort of blabbing again, but...
No, that's okay. I have spoken to you over the phone in the past, but I guess, in fact, I should have changed my question to say, how do you get the senior management within the councils to actually buy into that? Because working community development, we all talk that language, and I think there is a challenge in trying to get that actually cutting through as you go up through the layers. But I'm sure someone else has a question.
I just wanted to give Wendy a bit of positive feedback. She's a great person working for the council for young people and children, so don't feel too depressed. We think you're great.
What you have to do is get buy-in. But one way to do buy-in is to look at when councils go regressive, what do they usually go regressive about? And it's usually youth crime, their perceptions, by the way, of youth crime. It's usually youth graffiti, and it's usually youth crime and graffiti and youth gangs, okay? And one of the counters to that is the contradictions, of course. Melbourne City Council now highlights that we're the graffiti alley capital of the world in the Southern Hemisphere, and come to Melbourne and see our wonderful graffiti. Meanwhile, they're stomping on young people who are trying to do other kind of graffiti. But there's a way to recast the issue of graffiti in a more positive direction. In terms of youth gangs, then they've got to talk, which kids are you talking about? And anyway, we're getting really into the nitty-gritty of youth work as well as...
And certainly there's some of the things, I've been doing a 2-year project around street art and those sorts of things, and you're right, that has been exactly where the funding has come from and where the council strategic direction has tended to be, is responding around antisocial behaviour and those sorts of issues. I'm writing a youth engagement framework, and I'm trying to cut it through across the whole of council so that the whole of council sees it as a role, not as my role as a youth officer there, that there's actually a broader commitment to it. But I'm really holding this, and I might have a conversation with you privately and see whether or not there might be some way of you helping me.
Well, let me just end this particular conversation with this story, which is the manager of Midland Shopping Centre 20 years ago in Perth, Western Australia, was having a problem with vandalism in the shopping centre and a problem with shoplifting. So there you go, grown-up problems. And his first gut reaction was, I've got to hire some more security guards. And so he'd done the costings and he thought he's going to hire 2 full-time security guards to cut down on vandalism and shoplifting. He went home that night and he had teenage kids. And they were just having dinner together. So you must eat with your children once in a while. They were having dinner together. And lo and behold, he asked them, well, what would you do? And they said, well, have you talked to the kids? Oh. And anyway, through his conversation with his own teenagers, he ended up striking a deal with Midland City Council. This is, again, I'm going back 20 years. And they hired a part-time youth worker, half paid for by the council, half by the shopping centre. And the youth worker was initially the liaison between the shopping centre management and the young people. Within 6 months, the graffiti and vandalism died right down. The shoplifting really changed. And the reason why is that the young people who were hanging around felt that they were being listened to. They felt way more welcome. And over time, the manager started to hold once a month Friday afternoon rock concerts in the shopping centre. And so everybody buys in. There's a buy-in by everybody. So it's that kind of stuff. And that's why we need to collect our stories. Because all of us here would know of something that's worked, but we need to tell somebody or get that written down or compile it. Because that's how you convince the powers that be.
How would you address trauma and the idea of youth justice? I know that you mentioned jury making and a few other things, but is there a certain amount of financial support there to help with the trauma of the youth rather than just them when they get into trouble?
It might be interesting to talk about what we're doing at Ashley, even though, what I said before. Because Ashley is a problem, because it has got so few children there, and some of the ones that are really there on bail and shouldn't be there. But what they've decided to do is just a trial with one of the units there of a trauma-based approach. Staff there, or as you said, some good staff, but they are not youth workers. They're called youth workers, but generally speaking, maybe not trained. So they've brought in, I'm casting, I think it's the Australian Family Association, Childhood Foundation are in there working with that particular unit to try and change the whole process to a therapeutic model, because they realise that all those kids in there are suffering from some sort of trauma. So they've only started beginning of this year, so I don't know how it's going, but that's one of the things that, is good progress.
Just to follow that, how did we used to deal with bullies in school? How did we used to deal with bullies in school? Punish them and exclude them, right? and expel them, right? But the more up-to-date, contemporary, progressive practice is to realize that, in fact, bullying is usually symptomatic of something else. And so rather than excluding the bully, the idea is to pull them into some kind of process of interaction, perhaps a therapeutic process. So part of the difficulty and why I'm groaning when you said, how do we deal with trauma, is that the first gut response to young people and older people who've experienced trauma in their lives is to lock them up. And our prison, Risdon, is absolutely chock-a-block with people with mental illnesses and psychological difficulties because of trauma. And yet we know the statistics, 80 or 90% of all the women in prison have been subject to abuse of some kind. A large proportion of the young men and older men in prison have been abused, physically abused, if not sexually abused at some time. So we know that trauma plays a big part in their lives, but this is why we need the sensitivities to understand that acting out behavior means that we have to act to address the causes of that behavior. But frankly, we're pretty slow off the mark.
At Risdon, and so is anything being done at the moment, like education or support for those people in Risdon?
Oh, see, part of the problem with the way in which we deal with anybody who's institutionalized, but particularly within juvenile justice or adult prison, is that if you're a kid, and remembering that it's almost a 1-to-1, 100% that if you've been in a child protection, that you'll end up in juvenile justice, okay? What happens is that people move from place to place, institution to institution, agency to agency, but there's no continuity. So you get these kids who might come into Risdon for 3 months. They might be for 6 months on remand. But they're in Risdon, they get education. But what happens when they leave? See, and there's huge problems of continuity. And that's with the adult prison as well, which is why we must always have some kind of transitional programming around both entry and release. So we do have education programs and a range of things for the children in Ashley. But again, if that kid leaves and goes into a chaotic household without other kinds of supports, then you're setting that kid up to fail again. How are we doing? Any? Yeah.
What do you think of the new government's approach to options I can't think of the word.
Suspended sentences.
Suspended sentences.
I
just asked about the options to suspended sentences that the new government's going to institute.
Well, technically, as a member of the Sentencing Advisory Council, we as a council have decided not to comment publicly on this outrageous thing, but but in fact, I'm not going to make it, but there's a meeting at 4 o'clock of the Sentencing Advisory Council this afternoon with Vanessa Goodwood, the Attorney General, and that's up for discussion. What I'm hoping happens is that she refers it to the council for its specialist expertise, and then we can sit on it and actually deal with it properly. The issue was that if you take away suspended sentences, you're taking away another option that keeps people out of prison. And she did mention the thought of replacing it with some other options in the community. The problem is other states like Victoria are also cutting out those community-based options. And so home detention is being cut out of some states now. Alternative, periodic detention, where you go inside for a couple of days a week. Some of that jurisdictions are cutting that out. So it has to be looked at really carefully. But the last thing we want to do for children, young people, and adults is put them in institutions. What we do need to do is nest them in strong relationships, but in the community.
What's the reasoning behind the ending of periodic detention and the other alternatives in other states? Is that a budget thing? Is it a work thing?
I've been starting to read some of the literature on it. Some of it's just an ideological, we're going to get tough and this is namby-pamby. Some of it, they haven't done adequate evaluations, and some of it's just poorly set up programs that aren't working very well because they were poorly set up. So there's a variety of reasons. I'm not necessarily against some of that stuff, and I've been reading some of the critical reviews of the critics, and the critical reviewers of the critics are actually saying, well, actually, there is an ideological dimension behind some of it that we need to take on board. But we do, if we're going to do it, you have to do it a lot better. But it's the same with anything. Any intervention that we have has to be looked at all different angles, and we need continuous evaluation of everything we do. And things have a use-by date. Once we set stuff up, sometimes it's better just to let it go.